Follow my rules, or you can quit right now." Eleanor Whitfield did not raise her voice. She did not need to. 12 people sat around the conference table, and every one of them went still. Nolan Ashworth unpinned the badge from his collar and set it on the table without a sound. He did not argue. He did not look at her twice. He walked toward the door. Behind him, chairs scraped back, one after another, until the room stood empty of everyone but Eleanor and the hum of the air conditioning. She had wanted obedience. She got silence instead, and an empty room that felt louder than anything she had ever heard. By 7 the next morning, the lobby of Whitfield Collective looked the way it always looked: polished floors, a wall of glass facing the Denver skyline, elevators gliding up and down on schedule. It was the 4th floor that told the truth. 12 desks sat untouched. No coffee cups, no jackets on the backs of chairs, just the low whir of monitors nobody had bothered to turn off, throwing pale light across empty keyboards. Eleanor stood in the doorway of the creative department for a long moment before she made herself walk through it. She had expected 2 or 3 people to waver, to call in sick, to ask for a second chance before the day was out. She had not expected all 12. She counted the desks twice, as if the number might change on the second pass. It did not. 3 months earlier, when Nolan Ashworth had walked into her office for his interview, he had not looked like a man with anything to prove. He wore a plain gray sweater and carried a portfolio thinner than half the other candidates. He answered every question directly, offered nothing extra, and left exactly on time without lingering to make small talk. Eleanor remembered thinking he was competent, unremarkable, safe. She had hired him because he was quiet, not because she expected him to matter. Across town, in a small house with a crooked mailbox and a lawn that needed mowing, Nolan sat at the kitchen table while his son Sam ate cereal and talked with his mouth full about a science project involving volcanoes and baking soda. Nolan nodded along, asked the right follow-up questions, and did not mention that he no longer had a job to go to that morning. He poured more milk into Sam's bowl and told him to hurry or they would be late. "You're not going to work?" Sam asked, noticing the absence of the travel mug Nolan usually filled before they left the house. "Not today," Nolan said, folding a dish towel with more care than it required. "Are you sick?" "Nope, just taking the morning off." Sam grinned like that was the best possible answer, satisfied with an explanation an adult would have picked apart in seconds, and Nolan let him believe it was that simple. He walked his son the 6 blocks to school, listening to a full account of the volcano project, and did not check his phone once. Back at Whitfield Collective, Marlene Cobb knocked twice on Eleanor's door before letting herself in, a tablet pressed flat against her chest like a shield. "Halden Group called," she said. "Their marketing director wants to know why nobody on their account is answering emails. He's called 3 times since 8. Tell them the account is being reassigned." "Reassigned to who, Eleanor?" "The whole team is gone. Not some of them. All 12 in one morning." Eleanor did not answer right away. She looked past Marlene at the empty floor below, the dead monitors, the chairs no one had bothered to push back in. She told herself the rule had been reasonable: show up on time, submit work through the proper channels, stop treating deadlines like suggestions. None of it should have cost her an entire department in a single meeting, but numbers did not care what was reasonable. By noon, finance had already flagged 3 campaigns behind schedule and 1 client threatening to pause payment altogether. Eleanor sat with that fact for a long time, staring at a spreadsheet that would not resolve itself no matter how many times she refreshed it, before she picked up her phone and set it back down again, unsure who she was even trying to call. By 2 o'clock, she had walked the 4th floor twice more, as if a third look might rearrange what she already knew. She stopped at Nolan's desk, the only one with a framed photograph still sitting on it. Sam at maybe 5 years old, missing a front tooth, grinning at whoever held the camera. She had never noticed it before. She had walked past that desk a dozen times without once seeing the man who sat at it as anything more than a line item on an organizational chart. If she could not bring the team back by asking, she decided she would replace them by Friday. That meant pulling personnel files, cross-referencing portfolios, finding out exactly who she had lost and how hard each one would be to duplicate. She started with Nolan Ashworth because his file was the thinnest, and thin files made her nervous in a way she could not fully explain to herself. What she found stopped her hand on the mouse. Buried in the onboarding paperwork was a name she did not recognize. At first, a legal name change filed 6 years earlier, cross-referenced, almost as an afterthought, by an HR intern who had never thought to flag it for review. Nolan Ashworth had once been Nolan Cray Merriweather, and under that name, 6 years ago, a freelance systems architect had submitted the original build documents for something called Meridian, the campaign optimization engine that still ran, quietly and constantly, underneath every account. Whitfield Collective touched. Eleanor had heard the word Meridian 100 times in board meetings. She had signed off on its budget line every quarter without asking a single question about how it worked. She had never once heard the name of the man who built it. She read the file twice to be sure, then sat back in her chair and let it settle over her exactly how deep the miscalculation went. She had not fired a mid-level creative director who was slow to follow instructions. She had driven out the one person who understood, better than anyone alive, why the system worked at all. Across the city, Nolan stood in a park with Sam, feeding out string as a kite fought the wind and finally caught it, climbing hard against a flat gray sky. Sam whooped and ran backward, tangled the line around his wrist, and Nolan laughed for what felt like the first time in days, reaching over to untangle him without letting go of the spool. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at the screen, the company's main line, calling for the third time that morning, and let it ring out, sliding it face down into his jacket. "Who keeps calling you?" Sam asked, breathless, watching the kite climb higher. "Nobody important," Nolan said, and meant it, at least for that afternoon. Eleanor, meanwhile, sat alone with a truth she had not asked for. She had built her authority on the idea that rules applied equally, that no one was too valuable to be held to them without exception. Now she understood that the man she had let walk out the door held more leverage over her company's survival than the entire executive floor combined. And he had never once used it, never once mentioned it, never once let it show in 3 months of quiet, competent work. That silence unsettled her far more than any threat could have. Across town, in a private dining room with a view of the mountains going gold in the late afternoon light, Desmond Cray sat across from a man Eleanor had never met, an investor with a firm's worth of capital and no name on the reservation. "It's happening faster than we expected," Desmond said, turning his glass slowly on the tablecloth, watching the wine catch the light. "She'll need someone steady to catch her when the board turns." He did not smile, but something in the careful way he said it made clear this was not concern. It was a plan already 3 steps ahead of Eleanor, moving quietly while she was still learning the shape of what she had lost. "And if she figures it out?" the investor asked, setting down his glass. "She won't," Desmond said. "Not in time to matter." Eleanor drove herself. No assistant, no car service, following an address pulled from a personnel file she was not technically supposed to access after hours. The neighborhood was modest small yards, basketball hoops bolted above garage doors, a street quiet enough that her car engine sounded too loud pulling up to the curb. She sat in the driveway for almost a full minute before she made herself get out. Nolan answered the door in a t-shirt with a paint stain on the sleeve, and for a moment neither of them said anything. She had rehearsed an opening line on the drive over, 3 different versions of it. All 3 evaporated the second she saw his face, unreadable, waiting for her to explain herself. "I'm not here to apologize," Eleanor said, which was not entirely true, but it was the only sentence she trusted herself to start with. "I didn't expect you to be. I need to understand why all 12 of them left, not just you." Nolan leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, and for the first time since she had known him, spoke more than a few sentences at once. "Because the rule wasn't about discipline. It was about control. You told a team that had been shipping good work for years that speed mattered more than getting it right. People don't walk out over a badge on a table, Eleanor. They walk out when they realize the person in charge doesn't understand what they actually build or care to find out. And you? Why did you walk first? Because somebody had to, or none of them would have believed it was allowed." The words landed harder than she expected. She had assumed his exit was pride, wounded and simple, the kind of thing that would cool off in a week. It was not simple at all, and she felt, standing on his porch, exactly how much she had underestimated him from the very first interview. A small voice interrupted from somewhere behind him. "Dad, is that your work person?" Sam appeared in the gap of the doorway, cereal bowl still in hand, Though it was well past dinner, studying Eleanor with the frank curiosity only a 9-year-old could get away with, Eleanor crouched slightly, meeting his eyes instead of towering over him. "Something like that," she said. "I'm Eleanor." "You're the one who made everybody quit," Sam said, not unkindly, just factually, the way children state things adults spend their whole lives avoiding saying out loud. Nolan's hand landed lightly on his son's shoulder, steering him back without scolding him. "Go finish your homework, bud. It's already done. Then go pretend to finish it again." Sam disappeared, laughing, and Eleanor stood, feeling something she rarely let herself feel at work: smallness. "I'll go," she said. "Probably for the best," Nolan answered, but there was no venom in it, only exhaustion worn thin around the edges. She sat in the car for a moment before starting the engine, watching the porch light flick off through the windshield, watching the silhouette of a father and son move past the front window toward the kitchen. It struck her that she did not know a single thing about any of the 12 people she had addressed that morning beyond their job titles and their attendance records. She had rules for all of them. She had never once asked what any of it cost them to follow. She drove home without the answer she had come for, but with a question she had not expected to bring back with her. How many other decisions had she made from the top of a building, without ever once standing at somebody's front door to see what they actually cost? By Monday, Desmond Cray had turned the empty 4th floor into a talking point. He raised it first in the weekly leadership call, phrasing his concern as sympathy, his voice pitched to sound like reluctance. "Losing 12 people at once isn't a personnel issue," he said, letting the words hang in the room a beat longer than necessary. "It's a leadership issue. I'd hate to see the board start asking, who's actually steering this company?" He suggested gently that creative operations might be safer under his direct oversight until things stabilized. Eleanor said nothing, and her silence was noted by at least 3 people in that meeting, pens pausing mid-note. Marlene found her afterward in the break room, staring at a coffee maker she had not turned on. "You should know Desmond's been pulling budget reports on the Halden account for weeks," Marlene said, voice low, checking the hallway before she spoke. "Before any of this happened. Why would he need those?" Marlene hesitated, the kind of hesitation that had a shape to it, something held back on purpose. "I don't know," she said finally, though the careful way she said it suggested otherwise, and Eleanor understood, without being told, that the hesitation itself was the answer. Marlene had signed something once, years ago, that kept certain doors closed even when she wanted badly to open them. Across the city, in the back corner of a coffee shop that smelled like burnt espresso and something close to possibility, the 12 gathered around 2 pushed-together tables, laptops open, voices overlapping. A junior designer named Priya slid her laptop across to Nolan, a rough logo mock-up glowing on the screen. "If we're doing this," she said, "we're doing it right. Our name, our terms, our clients. Nobody's rushing anything," Nolan said, but he was smiling, the first easy smile any of them had seen from him in weeks. Around the table, people who had spent years quietly competing for credit inside Whitfield Collective were suddenly finishing each other's sentences, building something out of nothing because they wanted to, not because a contract told them to. Someone ordered a second round of coffee. Nobody checked the time. That night, alone in her office long after the building had emptied out around her, Eleanor pulled up the security footage from the conference room, the one file she had avoided watching since the morning it happened. She watched herself deliver the ultimatum, watched her own posture, her own tone, flat and immovable, arms folded like a closed door. She had thought she looked commanding. On the screen, she looked like someone bracing for a fight nobody else in the room had agreed to have. She watched Nolan stand. She watched him set the badge down without a flicker of anger, without a single wasted movement. She watched 11 other people rise, not one of them looking back at her for permission, not one of them hesitating at the door. For the first time, she understood that the room had not turned against her out of disloyalty. It had turned towards something else entirely, something she had never given them a reason to trust in her instead. She played it a second time, slower, pausing on Nolan's face right before he stood. There was no anger in it at all, only a kind of quiet certainty, the look of a man who had already made his decision long before he walked into that room. She closed the laptop and sat in the dark office for a long while, the city lights outside doing nothing to fill the silence her own ultimatum had left behind. The call from Halden Group came on a Wednesday morning, and it was not a request. Their marketing director informed Eleanor's assistant, in a tone that left no room for negotiation, that the account was being placed on hold pending a full leadership review of Whitfield Collective's creative division. It was the largest client on the roster, worth more than the next three combined, and the pause hit the company's quarterly projections like a dropped anchor, dragging everything down with it. Within the hour, Desmond had called an emergency board session. He stood at the head of the table, calm in a way that felt rehearsed, and proposed what he called a temporary solution, an interim creative oversight committee, chaired by himself, until stability returned to the department. Two board members nodded before he had even finished the sentence, their agreement already decided somewhere outside that room. Eleanor sat through it with her hands folded, aware that every word he said was designed to sound reasonable, and every word moved her closer to the door. She left the meeting and drove straight to Nolan's neighborhood for the second time in a week, except this time she did not rehearse anything on the drive over. She found him in his driveway, sleeves rolled up, halfway through fixing a bike chain for Sam, grease up to his wrists. "I'm not here as your former boss," she said. "I'm here because I don't know what else to do, and I'm tired of pretending I do." Nolan straightened, wiping grease from his hands with a rag that had clearly been used for the purpose many times before. He studied her for a long moment, the kind of look that weighed more than a question. "I'm not bringing the team back on the old terms," he said. "That offer isn't on the table, and it won't be, no matter how bad this week gets for you." "I'm not asking for that." "Then what are you asking for?" Eleanor exhaled, the honesty costing her something to say out loud, standing in a stranger's driveway with a client account collapsing behind her. "I don't understand how Meridian actually works." "Not really. I've been running a company on top of a system I never bothered to learn, and I think that's most of why we're standing here right now." Something in Nolan's expression shifted, not warmth exactly, but the beginning of it, a loosening around the eyes. "Come by tomorrow evening," he said. "I'll show you, not because it fixes anything tonight, because you should know what you almost threw away without ever understanding what it was." She thanked him and left before either of them could turn it into more than it was, glancing back once as she pulled away and seeing him still standing there, watching her go. Miles away, in an office with the blinds drawn even though the sun had not yet set, Desmond Cray opened a folder that did not have his name anywhere on it. Inside were budget approval records for the Halden campaign, dates altered just enough to look like routine delays instead of deliberate ones, each change small enough to survive a casual glance. He slid the folder into the bottom drawer of his desk, beneath a stack of unrelated files, and locked it with a key he kept on a chain no one else had ever seen. He had done this kind of thing before, quietly, patiently, and it had always worked because no one had ever thought to look. He had no reason yet to believe this time would be any different. Marlene had not slept well in 3 days, and by Thursday evening she could no longer justify the silence to herself, not with the vote she'd overheard being planned for the following week. She waited until the building had thinned out to almost nothing, then knocked on Eleanor's door with a manila envelope pressed flat against her side, as if she could will it invisible. "I need you to look at this before I lose my nerve," Marlene said, and set the envelope on the desk with hands that were not quite steady. Inside were copies of budget approval logs for the Halden account, spanning 4 months, each one stamped with delays that made no operational sense, sign-offs that sat untouched for weeks at a time, approvals routed through an extra layer that had never existed before this year began. At the bottom of each delayed request were the same initials, small and neat. DC. He slowed everything down on purpose, Marlene said. Every time the team asked for resources, he sat on it. Long enough that deadlines slipped, long enough that it started to look like your team couldn't keep up, when really they were being starved on a schedule. Eleanor read through the dates twice, doing the math in her head, and the picture assembled itself with a clarity that made her stomach drop. The rule she had issued, the ultimatum that emptied the 4th floor in a single morning, it had not come from nowhere. It had come from months of manufactured chaos she had mistaken for her own team's failure to perform. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Marlene's jaw tightened. "Because I signed an NDA when I took this job that covers information related to board members, and because my mother's medical bills don't care what's right or wrong. I'm telling you now because I'd rather lose my job then watch you lose yours over something you didn't do. Eleanor thanked her, quietly, and meant it more than any thank you she had given in years, reaching across the desk to press Marlene's hand once before letting go. That evening, she drove to Nolan's house as promised. But she brought the envelope with her instead of questions about Meridian. She laid the pages out across his kitchen table, under the same light Sam did his homework by, and for the first time, she watched Nolan read something from her without a wall behind his eyes. "I owe you an apology bigger than the one I came here to give," she said. Nolan studied the pages for a long time before he looked up, running a thumb along the edge of one sheet as though checking it was real. He did not say it was fine, because it was not fine, but something in his posture eased, like a man setting down a weight he had been carrying since the day the badge left his collar. Later that night, Sam tugged at his father's sleeve while Nolan washed dishes, the water running warm over his hands. "Is she a bad person?" he asked. The question a 9-year-old asks without knowing how much it costs an adult to answer honestly. Nolan dried his hands slowly, buying himself a moment. "I don't think so," he said. "I think she's someone who's finding out the hard way what she doesn't know." Sam considered that with the seriousness only a 9-year-old could bring to a dish towel and a half-washed plate. "Is that different from being bad?" "It's the whole difference," Nolan said. By Friday, Eleanor and Marlene had built a case that no longer fit in a single envelope. They worked from a spare conference room on the 3rd floor, blinds closed, laptops open, cross-referencing approval logs against calendar records, until the pattern stood undeniable months of deliberate delay, engineered by one man who had never once had to explain himself to anyone above him. Nolan called that afternoon, his voice carrying a different weight than it had all week, steadier somehow. "I talked to the team," he said. "We're not coming back. Not yet, but we'll help you save the Halden account, if you're willing to fight for it in front of the board tomorrow morning." "Why would you help me do that?" "Because the 12 of us built something worth saving before you ever became CEO, and I'm not going to let it die because of Desmond Cray." They spent that night working side by side in a way neither of them had planned for. Eleanor pulled numbers while Nolan diagrammed the Meridian architecture across a whiteboard, translating 6 years of engineering into language she could actually use in a boardroom the next morning. Somewhere around midnight, their hands both reached for the same marker at the same time, and neither of them moved first, the small pause stretching a beat too long before Nolan finally pulled his hand back. It was a small thing. It stayed with both of them longer than it should have. "You could have let this company fall apart," Eleanor said, watching him work, the whiteboard marker squeaking against the surface. "Nobody would have blamed you for it." "I have a son who's going to ask me someday what I did when it mattered," Nolan said, not looking up from the board. "I'd rather have a good answer ready when he does." Around 11, Marlene came in with a tray of takeout containers nobody had ordered, having stopped at the diner 2 blocks over on her way back from checking one last set of records. She set the food down without a word and went straight back to cross-referencing dates against the Halden contract's payment schedule. And for a stretch of time none of them spoke at all, 3 people working in the kind of silence that felt less like tension and more like trust. Nolan glanced over at Eleanor around midnight, watching her rework the same slide for the 4th time. "You don't have to get every word right," he said. "You have to get the truth right. The board will follow if the truth is clean enough." "I've spent 6 years learning to sound certain in a room," she said. "I don't actually know how to sound honest." "Start with the timeline," he said. "It'll do the honesty for you." Across town, Desmond had caught wind that something was moving against him, a rumor from a junior board member, a canceled lunch, the kind of small signals a man who had spent years reading rooms could not afford to ignore. He spent the evening on the phone, calling in favors, reminding 2 board members of debts they owed him from years back, trying to secure enough votes to survive whatever Eleanor was planning, before he even knew the exact shape of it. He was still awake past midnight, running through names on a legal pad, crossing out the ones he was no longer sure of. By 2 in the morning, the whiteboard in the 3rd floor conference room was covered edge to edge, arrows and figures crowding every inch, and Eleanor finally set down her pen. "Tomorrow, then," she said. "Tomorrow," Nolan agreed, and for a moment neither of them moved to leave, the office quiet around them, the coffee gone cold in 2 abandoned mugs, the whole plan resting on a handful of hours neither of them felt ready to let go of just yet. The boardroom was full by 9 the next morning, every seat taken. Desmond seated at his usual place near the head of the table, with the easy posture of a man who believed he had already won. Eleanor stood at the front, Marlene beside her, a stack of documents squared neatly on the table in front of them both. She did not open with an apology. She opened with the timeline: 4 months of manufactured delays, each one traced back to the same set of initials, each one timed to land exactly when the Halden campaign needed resources most. The room went quiet in a different way than it had for Desmond's version of events the week before. Then Nolan walked in. He had not been invited, technically, but nobody stopped him, and nobody in the room quite knew who he was until he began to speak. He wore the same plain gray sweater he had worn to his interview 3 months earlier, and he stood at the front of the room the way a man stands when he has already decided the outcome does not depend on him being liked. He told them, plainly, that he was the original architect of Meridian, that he had built it under a different name 6 years earlier, and that the system had begun failing the moment the people who understood it were pushed out the door by a rule that mistook obedience for competence. A few board members exchanged glances. One of them, an older woman near the far end of the table, leaned forward slightly, recognizing something in the name Nolan had just spoken aloud, a memory from a technical briefing years before that suddenly made sense in a new light. Desmond rose halfway out of his chair. "This is absurd. You're going to take the word of a man who quit, and a woman clearly out of her depth. The word of the man who built the system you've been living off of for 6 years, Nolan said evenly, not raising his voice the way Desmond had raised his, "and the paper trail with your initials on it." Desmond's composure cracked for the first time anyone in that room had seen. He reached for his own folder, the one meant to discredit Nolan's background, only to find that the timestamps inside contradicted his own testimony dates he had signed himself, dates that placed him squarely behind every delay Marlene had uncovered weeks earlier. The vote, when it came, was not close. 7-1, with Desmond's own allies abandoning him the moment the paper trail became undeniable. Their hands going up almost in unison, he was removed from his board position before lunch, escorted out through the same lobby that had once been empty of everyone but Eleanor and the sound of the air conditioning. Eleanor should have felt like she had won. Instead, standing in the aftermath, watching the room empty out around her, she felt only the size of the work still ahead. A boardroom victory did not put 12 people back at 12 empty desks. That would take something the vote alone could not give her. Marlene touched her arm on the way out. "You did the hard part," she said. "No," Eleanor said, watching Nolan gather his notes at the far end of the table without looking up. "The hard part is still in front of me." She thought about the 4th floor, still half empty, still waiting on 12 decisions that no board vote could make for her. Winning back a title was one thing, earning back a room was another entirely, and she had a much worse track record with the second one. Eleanor called the meeting for a Monday morning. The same day of the week, the ultimatum had been delivered weeks earlier, though she did not choose that on purpose until Marlene pointed it out. All 12 filed into the same conference room, wary, unsure why they had been asked back, a few of them glancing at the empty chair where Desmond used to sit in on reviews. She did not stand at the head of the table this time. She stood at the side of it, closer to their level than her own chair allowed, close enough that she had to look up slightly to meet Nolan's eyes. "I'm not here to ask you to come back," she said. "I'm here to tell you I was wrong, and to show you what changes, whether or not you decide to walk through that door again." She laid it out plainly: no more unilateral rules handed down from the top floor, a shared creative charter written with input from the people who actually built the campaigns, and a formal review process that made it structurally impossible for one person to quietly starve a project of resources ever again. It was not a performance. Marlene had watched her draft it line by line the night before, crossing out anything that sounded like it was written for a press release instead of for the people sitting in that room. "One by one," they answered. Priya spoke first, arms crossed, testing the weight of the offer before she trusted it out loud. "If I come back," she said, "I want to see the charter in writing before I unpack my desk." Eleanor slid a printed copy across the table without hesitation, and something in Priya's posture eased for the first time since she had walked in. Then another, and another, each decision landing not because a contract demanded it but because something in the room had genuinely shifted since the last time they sat in these chairs. A few asked questions about the review process, about who would have final say on creative disputes, now that no single person could quietly override the rest. Eleanor answered each one without flinching, and by the fourth question, she realized she was no longer bracing for the room to turn against her. Nolan was the last person Eleanor turned to. He did not answer right away. He looked at her for a long moment, the kind of look that measured everything that had happened between the badge on the table and this room, weeks compressed into a single held breath, and then he nodded once, without a speech to go with it. It was enough. Around the table, a few people exhaled, who had clearly been waiting to see what he would do before deciding for themselves. That afternoon, Halden Group's marketing director called personally to confirm the account was reinstated, having heard through back channels that the full original team was back in place, working under new terms. Eleanor took the call standing at the window overlooking the 4th floor, watching 12 people slowly filling 12 desks again, coffee cups appearing, monitors waking up one by one like a city coming back to light after a long outage. Marlene stood beside her at the glass, arms crossed, watching the same scene. "You know this doesn't fix everything," she said. "I know," Eleanor said, "but it's a start I actually earned this time." 3 weeks later, the 4th floor looked nothing like it had on the morning everyone quit. The far corner had been converted into an open lounge with a low couch and a scarred wooden table. And on a Friday afternoon, nobody objected to Sam camping out there after school, building something enormous out of cardboard and packing tape while his father worked nearby, occasionally passing over another roll of tape without being asked. Eleanor found herself walking that corner of the office more often than any executive job strictly required. She told herself it was to check on the Halden renewal materials stacked near the couch. Nolan never asked why she stayed, and she never offered an explanation beyond the one she gave herself. Some mornings she brought 2 coffees instead of 1, setting the second on the corner of his desk without a word, and continuing on to her own office. Some mornings he had already left one on hers before she arrived, still warm, a small unspoken exchange neither of them had ever agreed to out loud. Neither of them called it anything. It simply kept happening, week after week, until it stopped being a coincidence and became a quiet fact of the office nobody bothered questioning anymore. No one ever said the word out loud. There was no declaration, no rehearsed conversation over dinner, no moment either of them could have pointed to and called the beginning. There was only proximity, the two of them standing closer at meetings than the agenda required, the way Nolan's hand would brush the back of a chair Eleanor had just left, the way she started saving him a seat without deciding to, the way conversations that used to end at the office door now stretched into the parking lot. Sam noticed before either of them admitted anything. One afternoon, watching Eleanor help tape together a cardboard tower that kept collapsing under its own weight, he asked, without looking up from the glue stick, whether she was going to keep coming around after the Halden campaign ended. Eleanor did not have a rehearsed answer for that one either. "I think so," she said, and found that she meant it more than she expected to. On the evening of the Halden relaunch, the whole team gathered in the lounge they had built out of nothing, watching the new campaign go live on a screen mounted above the couch, the numbers climbing in real time across the bottom of the display. Sam stood between Eleanor and Nolan, one hand gripping each of their sleeves without seeming to notice he was doing it, cheering along with the rest of the room as the numbers ticked upward past every projection Marlene had run. Eleanor glanced sideways at Nolan, who was already looking back at her, and neither of them looked away first. Around them, the room kept cheering, kept watching the numbers climb, entirely unaware that something quieter and slower had just settled into place between the two people standing at its center. Later, after the room had emptied and Sam had fallen asleep on the couch with a piece of cardboard still gripped in one fist, Nolan carried him out to the car while Eleanor held the door. Neither of them said much. They did not need to. She had spent her whole career giving orders. It took losing all of them to learn the only rule that mattered was the one no one had to follow.